All right, everybody, we're going to get started. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Molly Robb, and I'm the project coordinator for the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare, or CEBC for short. I'd like to thank you all for joining us and welcome you to the webinar. Thank you for answering the poll questions. This is helpful information for our presenter. We've muted your phones due to the high number of participants attending, so if you're experiencing any technical difficulties or have any urgent questions, please use the Q&A pod located on the right side of the screen and we will do our best to assist you. We will also have a brief Q&A section at the end of the webinar. Please use the Q&A pod to send us your questions. Please also find the PDFs of the webinar PowerPoint slides at the top of the screen in front of you. Lastly, you will receive an email with a link shortly after the conclusion of this webinar to complete a short and easy survey so we can continue to improve our webinars and make them as useful and beneficial as possible in the future. Now, for a brief introduction of our presenter, Dr. Trask is a senior mental health researcher in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego, and a consultant for the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare. She has a doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her research focuses on improving mental health outcomes for children and youth through implementation of evidence-based treatment. She has examined outcomes for youth receiving public mental health services and who have experienced childhood sexual abuse. She is currently studying the use of common elements of evidence-based treatment in community mental health settings. So without further ado, here is Dr. Trask.
Welcome, everyone. So thank you, Molly, for the introduction. I know she talked a little bit about my research background, but I also teach. So I teach courses on evidence-based therapy and child psychopathology. And it was in the course of that work that I realized how beneficial the CEBC could be to students. So while I'm research and teaching, I also consult with the CEBC doing ratings and other types of consultation. And so I became familiar with the CEBC, the clearinghouse. I'll call it CEBC from now on because the name's too long. And with that familiarity, I realized that this is really something that students could benefit from in various areas. So I'm going to talk about how I teach students how to use the CEBC in my courses today. So if you don't have much familiarity with the CEBC and want more detailed information, there is a section online on past tutorials and webinars that you can access if you want a lot of detailed information. But the focus today is going to be on teaching students how to use the CEBC. Okay. So the goals of today's webinar are to identify students that could find the CEBC useful and to provide a rationale for why you might want to teach students how to use the CEBC. I'm also going to spend the majority of the time providing an example of how I teach students how to use it and how to practice it in class. And lastly, I'll provide suggestions about how to evaluate students' knowledge of the CEBC. So who would this apply to? So in general, any student that will eventually work in a mental health profession or in child welfare could benefit from learning about the CEBC in their courses. So this often, is a counselor. It could be a counselor eventually in substance abuse, social work, family counseling, individual counseling, school counseling, just across the board. Also, any administrator or caseworker in child welfare, somebody that will eventually do that work could benefit from learning about the CEBC. So you typically find these students in undergraduate programs in either psychology, social work, or human development. Those are all undergrads, but they could also be graduate students in a social work program or obtaining a PhD in counseling school or clinical psychology. So I think in graduate courses, this is even more real and applied for them because they're already seeing clients and they have internships. And so they can practice using the CEBC on real clients. Okay. So more specifically, what courses will you find these students in that the CEBC would be applicable to? Any social work practice course that's focusing on treating either individuals or families. A social work research course would also benefit. So either a psychology or social work research course typically teaches students how to evaluate evidence and how to search for treatments. And so this could be a useful course to use it in. Any effective counseling or evidence-based therapy course, this would be especially beneficial. So I know in San Diego, all of the major universities in their graduate programs now have evidence-based therapy courses, in their undergraduate programs. So all of our 4 main universities have this course now. So I think it's beneficial to not only teach students what treatments they should use, not just to use a textbook and say, okay, these are the treatments that have evidence, but to teach them how to find it. Because one textbook might not have every answer, and the evidence changes over time. So this is really a skill that students can use throughout their careers. A child psychopathology or a disorders of childhood course, this would be beneficial as well for students. So typically a child psychopathology course, you talk about what are various diagnoses, what does that look like in children, what's the course of the disorder, and then you talk about how to treat it. So this would be a good fit in the section where you're talking about how to treat different children with various presenting problems. And then, of course, more generally, any interventions or therapy course you could use the CEBC in. So then we get to why should you teach students to use it? Well, I think you can tell from my background, I think it's really important that clinicians are using treatments that have research support. And I typically lay the foundation with my students by showing them results of meta-analyses that show that treatment in the community is not always as effective as we'd like it to be. And in fact, sometimes it's not any more effective than no treatment at all. And so when I lay that foundation, they understand the importance. It helps them understand the importance of using an empirically supported treatment with their clients. And this is really a benefit, a very special chance to impact clinicians' training early on in their careers. It's much harder to impact training later on. I mean, people are very busy when they're clinicians. They have a high caseload and not a lot of time to learn new treatments. And so they use what they've been taught or, what their supervisor tells them to use. So this is just a really good chance to let them know that, these resources are out there. This is also a real-world application. So the CEBC can be used by a very busy clinician that is overworked and underpaid. A clinician doesn't have time to go and do their own literature search and go to, for instance, PsycInfo and try and figure out what treatments are effective for various clients, nor they might not have the skill set as well. So between maybe not having the skills to do it or the time, clinicians are just not doing this. And so this is an alternative way they could take a few minutes of their time and harness this resource to help improve their therapy with clients. Also, just to increase the awareness of such websites. So many students or clinicians aren't even aware that they exist. So just to know that it exists could be really helpful. Even if they don't start out by seeing clients, you never know. Perhaps they're going to be an administrator, or they work for an organization that develops training for instance, the county mental health system. Then just knowing that this is out there can help them understand what treatments are effective. Also, even if they are aware that these resources exist, that these sort of websites like the CEBC exist, they might not know how to use them effectively. So they might go there and really not understand how to do a search, or they might not be effective in doing it. So you can help them understand how to do that early on. Okay. So typically in class, there are 3 steps to teaching them how to use the CEBC. First, it involves demonstrating it to them in front of the class, and then having them practice it. And lastly, I typically evaluate their knowledge through some sort of test or an assignment. Now, I do want to make clear that that a lot of the examples are skewed towards the mental health field because that's the field that I'm in, but this definitely, all of these, the way that I presented this to students could be used in a social work course as well. So to demonstrate how to use the website, the first thing you need to do is teach students how to actually formulate a question. So they have to know how to formulate an effective question before they can run a search. And when you do demonstrate, to them how to search for it, that's when I review the scientific criteria with them simultaneously. So the scientific criteria is how we figure out whether a treatment is effective or not. And there are different ways to search, and so I typically show them how to search multiple ways by topic area and by program. So to go back to the first step, so in formulating a question, students need to be able to develop an answerable question, something that's really brief, it's short, it's very specific. And it can be really helpful if students know some background about what they're searching for. So if a student knows nothing about depression, I might have them do a web search on depression to see what the most common treatments are. But I'll never just say do just a general web search. I'll point them towards reputable resources like the Mayo Clinic or the National Institute of Mental Health. So I'll have them read what depression is and what the common treatments are, and it just gives them, and what the outcomes are. So it helps give them a little bit more of a background before they go into their search. The other thing that they need to be able to do is specify what population they're looking for a treatment for. So is it a preschooler? Is it a school-age child? Is it an adolescent? What is the presenting issue? Is it depression? Is it trauma? Is it anxiety? They need to be specific to do a search. And they also need to know what outcome they're looking for. So for instance, with trauma, is the child experiencing depression? Are they experiencing PTSD? What are they experiencing? So all of these, a student needs to know all of these before running a search. Okay. There are different ways to run searches, and here are 3 examples of ways that you could do a search. So there's a more general question, which is what treatments are effective for a specific problem, like trauma or depression. You could also say more specifically, is a specific treatment effective? So is trauma-focused CBT effective? You need to know what outcomes are targeted by a specific treatment. So in the case of trauma-focused CBT, what outcomes are targeted by that treatment? Is it PTSD? Is it depression? Is it anxiety? And you also need to know the target population. So what age range was this developed for? And what does the research say that it's effective for? Lastly, you can say, how do 2 treatments compare? So for instance, if a student doesn't know anything about depression, but they looked on the NIMH website, they might find that interpersonal therapy for adolescents is effective as well as CBT. So they might, a search might be, is interpersonal therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy more effective in treating depression in adolescents? So you can see there are different ways to run searches, but you need to be able to formulate a clear question before moving forward. So to go into a specific example for trauma, because that's my background, I've worked with kids who are sexually abused. So if you look at what is the population, so I'm going to specify it more generally. It's a school-age population, which means not preschoolers, not adolescents. So this tends to be around ages 6 to 12. And these are kids who have been sexually abused or experienced trauma. So the outcome of interest in this case is reduction of PTSD symptoms. So you want to see those PTSD symptoms that they have go down by the end of treatment. And what treatments have been shown to do that? Sorry, getting sick. So a question might be, what treatments are effective for children who have experienced childhood sexual abuse and have PTSD symptoms? So this is an example of how to formulate a question to run your search. So once a student they know how to formulate a question, they need to understand what the rating system is, so how to interpret what they find. So even if they find that there's a treatment, they might not know what the number associated with it means. So I tend to review it with them in detail. I won't go into it as in detail here, but it is on the website if you have an interest in knowing more. But in general, what's really important for students to know is that a 1 is really good and a 5 is not good. So the lower the number, the better the treatment and the more research evidence that treatment has. So for instance, programs rated a 1 is considered an empirically supported treatment. And to be rated a 1, they have to have at least 2 randomized controlled trials showing that that treatment is better than another treatment or a comparison practice. And the effects of treatment must have lasted at least a year after the end of treatment. So in the case of PTSD, at the end of treatment, about a year after the end of treatment, their PTSD symptoms are still significantly lower than a comparison group or than a comparison treatment. It's really helpful for students to have some idea of what a randomized controlled trial is. And I found when I teach these courses, they're upper division courses, that all of these students have had some sort of research methods course, so they should be familiar with what a randomized controlled trial is and how it's the gold standard for establishing whether something's effective. But it can be helpful to review it as well with them. Okay, so to actually go into an example of how I would do a search or how I would demonstrate it to them, first I would define the question. So in the case of sexually abused children, the age would be school age. The question, just as a review, would be what treatments are effective for children who experience sexual abuse? And the outcome we're looking for is a reduction of PTSD symptoms. So now I'll go to the CEB website and show how you do that. Okay. All right, so this is the home screen for the CEBC. And if you want, let's say you have some background knowledge of what treatments are effective for treating trauma, then you could go to the search box and you can search for it. So many people in child welfare or that work with any kids that have experienced trauma know or have had a training on trauma-focused CBT. So you might search for trauma-focused CBT. Okay. And just make sure everyone's seeing this thing. Okay. And see that no search has come up. So this is a common problem that happens when you're teaching students, and what you don't want them to do is to give up. And so this is why it's beneficial sometimes to make mistakes or misspellings so you can troubleshoot it with them. So that didn't work out. So I'm not sure why it didn't, but let's try something else. So trauma-focused CBT.
Hey, Emily?
Yes.
We are unable to see your shared screen internet.
Okay, let's try that again. Share my screen. Share. Can you see it now?
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so I'll start that over. So if you go to the home website and you're searching for a treatment, let's say you know background on trauma treatment, so you can search for trauma-focused CBT. And for those of you that just read this, I apologize, but no programs are found matching this treatment, but you know it exists, and you know it should be on the CEBC. So you can search another way. I'm just going to use the acronym, and then you see that trauma-focused CBT does pop up. So let's say a student continues to try and search for a treatment, and it still doesn't pop up. It's not recognizing it, or there's some misspelling. So you can go more generally to a topic area, and you have to find trauma treatment. So they could do just a search if they want for trauma treatment, or they could go under mental health and search for it. So we're looking for treatment for PTSD, which should be under mental health. You see there's anxiety, attachment, depression, trauma treatment for adults, and then trauma treatment for children. So once you go under trauma treatment for children, you see that there are 3 programs actually rated as a 1, and so these are the programs that you'd want the students to focus on. Now, there aren't always treatments rated a 1 for various issues, but for trauma there are. So I would encourage students to only look at programs rated as a 1, or at least start there. So there are 3 treatments. There's eye movement desensitization, so EMDR. There's prolonged exposure therapy, and trauma-focused CBT. If we go back up to prolonged exposure therapy for adolescents, it doesn't look like it's the right population. So if we're looking for school age, so about 6 to 12, that doesn't look like it's the right age. So I'll just confirm. So when you click on the website, it has information about this program, and it has the age range that the research has been reviewed for. And this is ages 12 to 18, so that does not overlap with what we're looking for. So we wouldn't want to use that. So now I can click on EMDR, and it's rated a 1. Its target population is children who have experienced trauma, so that's a check. That's what we're looking for. Kids have experienced PTSD. That's also what we're looking for. And it's for ages 2 to 17. So that also is the age range that we're looking for. So I like to point out to them the first time they're using this that right below program information, there is a brief description of the treatment. So it's good for them to review and familiarize themselves with that. If they want more information, they can click on View Detailed Report, which gives a really detailed information about the treatment. And if they scroll all the way down, there is much more detailed information about the research supporting the treatment. So you have to click on the Show Relevant Research, and they can see the specific studies that were used to get that rating of a 1. So perhaps they need more information. The program information didn't have everything they needed to make sure that it was relevant for the client that they're wanting to find a treatment for. So they can find this information here. Okay. So EMDR is a possibility, so they would note that. And if they go back, there is one more, so trauma-focused CBT. Click on that. It's also rated a 1. Its target population is children with trauma history who are experiencing PTSD symptoms. So again, that's the population we're looking for, and that's the outcome we're looking for. So those are both checks. And then it is for children ages 3 to 18. So again, the research has shown that it's effective for children ages 3 to 18. So this meets the criteria we're looking for. I want to point out one other thing. So if we're comparing EMDR and trauma-focused CBT, there's one other aspect you want to look at, which is the child welfare relevance rating. So if the child is in child welfare, this might be a more applicable program because it's rated high versus medium for EMDR, meaning it has been used with kids with child welfare, and research has shown that it's effective for children in child welfare. Again, if you scroll down, there's basic information about what trauma-focused CBT is and the program goals, so they can just confirm it's used to improve child PTSD symptoms, which is our target outcome that we're looking for. Okay, I'm going to go back to the webinar now. Okay. Okay. All right. Sorry, there's a problem with the PowerPoint. There we go. All right, so we identified trauma-focused CBT and EMDR using the CEBC as possible treatments for kids who have experienced sexual abuse and are having PTSD symptoms. So this is a really good place to start. Now I realize it's much more nuanced than this. So, you know, if you have a graduate class, you might want to go into more detail about the training that's required. So, you know, what treatments really are feasible? What treatments are available? Do they require a team? For instance, multisystemic therapy is highly effective for youth with substance abuse and acting out behaviors and delinquency in adolescence, but it's just not practical for many clinicians because you have to work in a team, your organization has to support it, you have to have extensive training and supervision. So not only can treatment doesn't only have to be effective, but it has to be feasible as well. You have to be able to actually provide it. Okay. So as I showed earlier, it can be really helpful to actually make mistakes as you're going along so students understand how to troubleshoot it. For anything from misspellings or perhaps you select a prolonged exposure, and then realize that it's not the right program for children that are school-aged. The other thing I've done, not only do I demonstrate this in my in-person classes, but I've taught this online as well. So I'll record myself doing the presentation, and then I'll post it online. So the students that are in my online section can benefit from the demonstration as well. So now that you've done a demonstration for students, it's time for them to practice it. So I typically have students get into groups of 2 or 3 in class and practice it together. And I do give them advance notice, so I have everybody bring a laptop, but if everyone doesn't have it, it doesn't matter. Only 1 out of every 3 students needs to have one if they're in a group of 3. And this has never been an issue, no matter where you're teaching. So I've taught at schools with disadvantaged youth, really low socioeconomic status, and it was not a problem to find 1 out of every 3 students to have a laptop in college. So they do this in groups, and I have them choose a different treatment or a different client, and I'll go into that a little bit more on the next slide. But what I really like to do at this point is to troubleshoot any issues they have when they're doing this search. So this should be a really interactive practice that they're doing. So I don't just sit, behind the desk, but as they're doing this group practice, I rotate around the class and I ask them questions. I see what difficulties they're having. And then sometimes I need to take some time to figure it out on my computer. And once I figure it out, then I demonstrate that for them. So I project it to the class and I walk them through how I problem solved it so everybody can learn from it. Okay. So there are multiple ways that you can set this up, no matter what sort of class you're in. You can give them a list of a treatment, or a mental health issue. So you're looking for treatments for different anxiety disorders, depression, separation anxiety, substance abuse, bipolar. They can select a treatment and go from there, or you can provide each group a case study, in which case they could use that to formulate a question, using the population, the outcome of interest. Or some students are already working with clients, especially if they're graduate students, but even in my child psychopathology class, the students were doing an internship through the schools in which all of the students had a diagnosis. And so I had them choose the students they're already working with to develop the background question and search for a treatment. But it's really important that if they're doing this, you make sure that they preserve confidentiality and it's completely de-identified. They don't use any names, they don't use exact ages, they use an age range. So if the child is 10, they say, school age, 6 to 12 or something. So just make sure that that's very clear, because especially with undergraduate students, they just are not as sensitive to confidentiality. Okay. So to guide their search, I give an evidence-based therapy worksheet that they can use. So the first thing that they do is to formulate that question. So that's what I mean by identify the mental health problem in a population. And then they search for the evidence. So I typically like them to find at least 2 different treatments that would be recommended based on the evidence, and then to briefly describe that treatment so we have an idea of what it is. I like them to note any problems they have completing the search, so I or other students can troubleshoot that. And then I like them to think about how they could use these resources in their career. And the students are pretty resourceful in terms of thinking through how they might use this, even if they aren't necessarily going to be a counselor, but they might use it in research or in administration or other areas. Okay. So you can use the same formula of how I teach this to extend this to social work courses. So you could teach students to search for effective interventions, and just instead of mental health issues, you're searching for evidence for mentoring for students, teen pregnancy, placement stabilization, reunification, home visiting programs, prevention or early intervention in various areas. Or, since many of you are in child welfare, you know that some of the common issues that parents come in with are anger issues, domestic violence, and substance abuse, in which case the CEBC has a nice overview of treatments for adults in those areas. So how do I evaluate their knowledge? Sometimes I do multiple choice questions on exams, like, I have them, I tell them, ask them a question and have them tell me whether that research shows that it should be rated a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4 on the scientific rating scale. You could also give them a case study and have them formulate a question and identifying the population and the outcome of interest, so kind of a short answer question. You can also have them describe the benefits or the purpose of the CEBC for use in their various fields. If there's not enough time in class or you want them to do this as a take-home assignment, they could just briefly do something in class with their group, and then you can send this home as a take-home assignment, and they can use that worksheet to guide them. So I would have them complete a 1 to 2 page overview using that worksheet as a guide, and make sure that they identify the research that's supporting the effectiveness of the programs that they choose, that they say are effective. And you can do this the same way. So you can have them identify a mental health problem or a specific client to do this assignment for. Okay. So CEBC is not the only evidence-based practice digest search engine. There are others, but it's really important to note that all clearinghouses have different rating systems. And so you need, if you're going to teach them to students or send them there, you need to make sure that they're familiar and you're familiar with the sites before sending them there. So for instance, NREP is one that I often teach hand in hand with the CEBC. It's the SAMHSA's program to search for evidence-based programs in mental health and substance abuse, but the rating system is completely opposite. So a 4, is the highest rating you can get on NREP, but it's a low rating on the CEBC. So a 1 is really good on the CEBC, and a 1 is really bad on NREP. So it's really important that they know those nuances and can understand that the rating systems differ before you send them there. Also, each of these sites has a really different focus, so you would choose the site that best fits the class that you're teaching or that's relevant for. So NREP and the CEBC are great for mental health courses, but if you're doing educational psychology, then the What Works Clearinghouse would be a good fit. Or if you're doing blueprints, if you're looking at prevention programs for juvenile delinquency or violence, then blueprints could be a good resource as well for students. Okay. That was the overview of how to use the CEBC with students and how to teach them. I'm interested in your questions, but not only that, I'm interested to see if you have other ideas about how to use the CEBC in either social work or psychology classes, or other additional ways to evaluate knowledge in these classes. So if anybody has any ideas, I would welcome them.
So now you guys can go ahead and use the Q&A to ask any questions that you have for Emily.
Or if there's something else you'd like me to demonstrate on the website, feel free to ask and I can go back and do that as well. Okay, so there's a question that says, how do you talk with students about rating changes and how that impacts choices about programs? You know, I've never really gone into that much detail with students, but that is definitely something that I think about in my mind. But I think, you know, one of the ways I guess you could talk about it is that instead of just telling students, you know, these are the treatments to use, these are the treatments that are effective, you know, you're teaching them how to use a skill and how to use this website. And so, they can continually go to it, if they have questions to see what the most recent research evidence is. So it's not something that they, only need to use once, but, they can check it once a year or every other year, especially if they're treating, very specific disorders like trauma. They could go to it regularly and see if the evidence has changed, if the rating has changed, because sometimes they do change as treatments get more evidence. So that could be definitely beneficial for them to know, and that's actually a good idea. I haven't actually mentioned to students that that's something that it is evolving, and so they should continue to, access it and look at what the recent research evidence is and whether ratings have changed. So there is a worksheet that I've used in my course with students. It's on the PowerPoint, the handout that should be on the top right of your screen. So if you download the slides, then you can see the worksheet that I've used. It's just 4 questions that the students can use as a guide to do either at home or in groups. And just let me know if you have trouble with that, and I'm happy to send it to you. It's just something that I created. So somebody says that they teach a social work. Oh, okay. Sorry, 1 second. Yes, so somebody says that they teach a social work course at UC Berkeley. It's an undergraduate course, and that they give them, maybe it's a client, a case study, and that they have to do a case and intervention plan at the end. So they thought maybe they could use the CEBC to have them come up with specific evidence-based interventions to use in that assignment. I think that's an excellent idea. In my behavioral disorders course, the students also either had a case study or they used a specific client that they were working with, and I had them, it was mandatory that they use the CEBC or NREP as one of their sources. So they also had to use, because it was they do have to use some research in search engines as well, like PsycInfo, but at least one of their sources had to be from those websites, so I was sure that they knew how to use it and use it appropriately. So then they used it in more detail. So not only were they saying, okay, this is what's effective, but then they were saying, this is how I would use it with this client in this specific case. These are the modules that would be effective for this client. They're getting into details. So it was really beneficial for writing that final assignment. So I think that's a great idea. So question 4 that asks if I could demonstrate how to search for evidence-based programs for older adolescents leaving the foster care system, so transitioning out. So let me, this is not one that I've done, so I'm happy to try and demonstrate it for you and see if, I'm not sure if we have a topic on that area, transitioning out, but let me see. Okay, so you would go to topic areas, and it should be under core child welfare services, or, support services for youth. Okay, so this is a great example of one I'm not familiar with, so this is the sort of thing that students are going to be grappling with. So it's good that you can figure out how to do it too. So commercial exploitation, mentoring, permanency enhancement intervention. Here we go. Okay. So there is youth transitioning into adult programs. So you'd click on that. And you can read what the background is. So let's see if this is a fit. So it's youth who are aging out of the child welfare system while in out-of-home care and are transitioning out of the foster care system. So this is what you'd be looking for. So it doesn't look for there are any programs that were able to be rated. So there are, it looks like about 10 programs that you can at least look at and see what they are. You can read about them. So not able to be rated means that there just isn't research evidence to be able to rate it on the scientific rating scale. So doesn't mean that these programs wouldn't necessarily be useful to you. They just don't have research supporting their effectiveness yet. So hopefully I do know some are working on doing research, but you could at least search through them and see if they might fit your needs. So again, under topic areas, there was a support services for youth, and then youth transitioning into adult programs. Okay. Okay. And yes, definitely. So somebody said that many undergraduate students with little or no experience really crave resources, and you're right. I mean, it's really rare that students are not extremely happy to have this sort of resource. Now, like I said, in my courses, I still require them to use, PsycInfo and those sort of Avesco hosts, those sort of resources. They need to know how to use those search engines, but it's really helpful for them to have these resources as well. So question 5, how would I search the evidence-based research on the topic of effectiveness of housing assistance or rapid rehousing programs? Okay. So we really do not, this isn't something that we've rated before, so we only look at very specific programs, and this is not a topic area that we've done. I mean, I'm not sure if it's one that is scheduled to be done in the future, but it's not something that CEBC has rated in this area before. Sorry about that. So how this would be cited would depend on, what your course uses, but if you're using APA style, you would follow that in terms of the most recent, I think it's whatever the most recent APA manual is, you would have them follow that for citing a website. That's what I have my students do. They have to write their papers in APA style. So they would cite the source, when they accessed it. I think they have to include the date. I have to look at the exact way, but if you're curious how I have them do it, I could send you a link of how they've done it. I'm happy to do that. Just off the top of my head, I don't remember exactly, but I know they have to say the date that they access the information and the link.
All right, thank you everybody for your questions and for joining us for this webinar, and thank you Dr. Trask. We are going to go ahead and wrap things up.
Okay, thank you so much for your time and all of the great questions. I hope you found this useful.